She found a man with the same birthmark as her lost son, but the truth is more shocking than she ever imagined. Before the story begins, comment below which city you're watching the video from. We love getting to know our viewers. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more exciting stories. Enjoy the story and see you soon. At 63, Martha felt the weight of her years, but something much heavier than any physical tiredness lingered in her heart. The doubt she'd carried since her son's birth, a quiet, persistent feeling, grew stronger over time. It was like a shadow following her, a sense that something was wrong, that a piece of her life had been silently stolen. That morning, as she walked through her neighborhood park, Martha moved absent-mindedly, her thoughts guiding her steps more than her own feet, but something caught her attention. Just a few yards away, a man leaned against a tree, looking down with a tired expression. Martha noticed his humble appearance, worn-out clothes and a face marked with signs of struggle. When he raised his arm to adjust his hair, Martha's gaze landed on something striking. A crescent moon-shaped mark on his arm, a rare symbol she recognized all too well. Her heart raced and she felt her legs tremble. That mark, it was the same one she had on her own arm, the one she had always thought was meant for her son. The sight triggered a flood of memories, awakening a powerful mixture of hope and fear she had tried to suppress for so long. Martha hesitated, but felt compelled to find out more about the man. He noticed her presence, his face turning cautious as he gave a small nod. The doubt and wariness in his expression were unmistakable, and Martha knew it wouldn't be easy to start a conversation. But the possibility that he might be someone close, someone unexpected, gave her courage. "Excuse me, I couldn't help but notice," she began, her voice shaking. The man looked up, saying nothing but clearly listening. "That mark on your arm. It's a lot like the one I have," she continued, showing him her own mark with a slight smile. The man's face remained expressionless, as if he was used to guarding himself behind an invisible wall. He glanced at her arm, but dismissed the coincidence with indifference. "What does that have to do with anything?" he replied, his voice flat and unfriendly, as though any approach was a threat. The firmness in his tone unsettled Martha, but she struggled to stay calm. Something inside her told her not to give up. "I'm not trying to bother you. It's just that..." She hesitated. She wasn't sure how to explain the urgency she felt, but decided to press on. "That mark, it's always been important to me, like a connection to someone. And I felt a link when I saw it on you." The man chuckled humorlessly, shaking his head like someone who had heard empty promises before. "Look, I don't know what you're after, but my life's complicated enough without anyone giving me advice or talking about connections. I don't need anyone," he said, slowly backing away. Before Martha could say another word, he turned and disappeared toward the park exit. She stood there, frozen, watching the path he'd taken, her mind reeling from the impact of that brief encounter. For a moment, she felt foolish, but her heart wouldn't let go of the idea that there was more to that coincidence. That night, at home, Martha couldn't shake the thoughts of the man and the mark on his arm. Something told her that wouldn't be the last time she saw him. After the unexpected encounter in the park, Martha couldn't get the image of that man out of her head. The crescent moon-shaped mark on his arm was like an open wound in her memory, bringing back the anguish she had tried to bury for years. She barely slept that night, her mind weaving a hopeful but tangled story. Martha knew she had to find out more about him. But how? The next morning, determined to investigate, Martha returned to the park, but Samuel, she later learned his name wasn't there. She tried discreetly asking a few nearby vendors about him, but their answers were vague. Apparently, Samuel lived alone with no family, working wherever he could find, taking on heavy labor jobs to earn some money. He was a reserved man, known for keeping people at arm's length and distrusting goodwill. The more Martha learned, the more questions came to mind. What was his story? Where and with whom had he grown up? The answers seemed as distant as the mysterious mark on their arms. Still, something inside her told her not to give up. Martha decided she needed to understand her own past better. Old memories came rushing back, the birth of her son years ago, and that unique moment when she held him for the first time. But along with those memories came unresolved doubts. Deep down, Martha had always felt that something was off. Like the baby she brought home had come from a reality that wasn't hers. During that week, Martha tried to access the hospital records from when she had given birth. However, the years had taken their toll on those records, and the nurse's reluctance to share any information made her search even more difficult. Martha knew that the answers she sought wouldn't come easily, but that didn't weaken her resolve. The more she learned about Samuel, the more convinced she became that he might indeed be her lost son. One afternoon, she finally found him again at the same park. Samuel was sitting on his usual bench, staring into the distance, lost in thought. Martha took a deep breath and approached him once more, trying her best not to startle him. "I wanted to know more about you, Samuel," she said, softening her tone. "I don't have bad intentions. I just want to understand your story." Samuel glanced at her sideways with the same suspicion as before. "My story doesn't matter to anyone, least of all to someone like you. I've already told you, I don't need anyone," he replied sharply. Martha sighed, fighting back her frustration, but instead of giving up, she sat down on the bench next to him without waiting for permission. The silence stretched between them until she decided to break it. "I know it's hard to trust strangers, but sometimes people we think are strangers might have something in common with us, something important." Samuel shook his head, but didn't move away. His resistance was clear, but Martha sensed a small opening, however slight, for the possibility of a conversation. The connection Martha sought seemed to slowly reveal itself, and even without many answers, she felt closer to understanding, to a truth that could change both their lives. Days passed, but Martha's persistence in unraveling the mystery about Samuel only grew stronger. She spent her mornings and afternoons wandering the park, hoping he would show up. Sometimes she spotted him from a distance, standing off to the side, and quietly observed his movements. It was as if there was something familiar in that man with his heavy, distant gaze that she couldn't quite define. With each passing day, her hope for answers grew, but Samuel's barrier seemed insurmountable. Finally, on a cold, cloudy morning, Martha saw Samuel again in the park. He looked more tired than usual, as if life was taking too high a toll on him. She watched him, deciding not to approach this time, but suddenly he stumbled and fell to the ground, lying motionless for a moment. Martha rushed over to him, her heart racing. "Samuel, are you all right?" she asked, anxious. He tried to stand up on his own, but was too weak. She insisted on helping him, and he reluctantly accepted, albeit begrudgingly. With some effort, Martha managed to get him to a nearby bench. Samuel was breathing heavily, his face showing clear signs of exhaustion. "Are you helping me just to ask about my life afterward?" he asked, a tone of distrust evident even in his moment of suffering. "It's not that, Samuel. I just can't see someone suffering and pretend nothing happened," Martha replied without taking offense, with a calmness he didn't expect. He was silent for a few seconds, perhaps surprised by her answer. Martha seized the opportunity to speak, feeling that this moment might be a chance to break through Samuel's defenses. "I know you don't trust me, but I believe our stories might be connected, and not by chance." Samuel looked away, fixing his gaze on the ground, as if resisting the temptation to listen to what Martha was saying. She continued, her voice low, as if speaking more to herself than to him. "When I brought my son home after giving birth, Something inside me said something was wrong, that maybe the baby I was holding wasn't really mine, but no one listened to me. They called me paranoid. Samuel took a deep breath, as though her words echoed something familiar in his own heart, something he, too, might have tried to bury. After a long silence, he finally let down his guard. My life's been full of doubts, Martha. I grew up alone, in places I don't even remember anymore. I've been cast aside so many times that honestly I've learned not to expect anything from anyone. Those words came out with deep bitterness, and Martha felt a pang of pain as she recognized the weight of loneliness that Samuel carried. It wasn't easy for him, and she could see that now. But in that moment of vulnerability, Samuel opened up just enough for Martha to glimpse the pain that had shaped his life. She took a deep breath, trying to control her emotions, and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Samuel, maybe you don't have to carry that weight alone. Maybe I can help, Martha said softly. He looked at her, his face still guarded, but something in his eyes seemed less resistant, less defensive. You want to help? Then tell me, why would someone like you care about someone like me? Samuel asked, his tone a mix of challenge and weariness. Martha hesitated but responded sincerely. Because I believe you might be someone very important to me, and even if I'm wrong, even if this is all just a misunderstanding, I still believe it's worth trying. Samuel said nothing, but for the first time, he didn't reject her words. Instead, he remained silent, as if pondering them with the seriousness they deserved. Martha knew this was just the beginning of a long journey, but at that moment, she felt that the distance between them had lessened, even if only by a fraction of a second. After that brief moment of connection, Martha and Samuel continued their routines, but with a subtle difference. There was now something undeniable that linked them, even if neither was ready to admit it. Martha, persistent as ever, kept visiting the park with the hope of seeing him again, even though they hadn't agreed to meet. What she didn't know was that Samuel, too, was returning to that spot more and more, as if the park bench had become a point of solace in a life marked by uncertainty. One morning, Samuel appeared and sat beside Martha unceremoniously. He looked exhausted, but his expression was different, as if something was deeply troubling him. Martha noticed and waited in silence, sensing that he was about to share something important. You know, I don't remember much from my childhood, Samuel began, his gaze lost in some distant point. The memories I do have are all fragments. I went through so many houses, so many unfamiliar faces. I wonder if I ever had a place to call home. Samuel's words struck a deep chord within Martha. She felt her heart ache, and the silence between them became heavy with an old pain, a shared sadness. She knew what it was like to have painful memories and unanswered questions. Samuel, I'm so sorry you went through all of that. No one should have to face that kind of loneliness, Martha said quietly. He shrugged, trying to appear indifferent, but Martha could see that the wounds he carried were deeper than any defensive attitude. After a moment, he spoke again, hesitant. I've learned not to trust people. Every time I tried, I ended up disappointed. People who promise to help and then disappear. Or worse, people who only show up when they need something. Martha listened attentively without interrupting. She understood his reluctance, his distrust. It was the armor he'd built to protect himself from the scars left by a life of abandonment. But in that moment, she felt she needed to open her heart and share her own pain, so he could understand that she wasn't there to take anything from him. You know, Samuel, for many years I also lived with a doubt, something that wouldn't leave me alone. Ever since I brought my son home, I felt like something was wrong. Even when I looked at him and tried to convince myself everything was fine, a part of me kept saying that something had been taken from me. She said, her voice choked with emotion. Samuel looked at her with a curious expression, perhaps even moved by the sincerity in her words. Martha continued, feeling as though those words needed to be spoken. I tried talking to the doctors, the nurses, but no one would listen to me. They said it was all in my head, that I was just scared because I was a new mother. And over time, I learned to silence that feeling, until I met you, Samuel. He remained silent, absorbing the weight of her words, unsure how to react. For a moment it seemed like he wanted to ask more, but he hesitated, perhaps afraid of what he might discover. Finally, he shook his head, as if trying to push away conflicting thoughts. This is all strange, he said, almost in a whisper, but something in me feels a void, like a part of my story is missing. Martha took a deep breath, feeling that a deeper connection had been established between them. They weren't just bound by a chance meeting, they were connected by pain, by a longing for something they weren't even sure they'd lost. She knew the road ahead was still long and full of obstacles, but at that moment, she believed that Samuel was finally starting to see that they might perhaps fill the empty spaces in their stories together. As Martha tried to strengthen her connection with Samuel, she barely noticed how her changes in behavior were drawing the attention of Marcos, her son. In recent days, he had been watching her with a critical eye, intrigued by how often she went out without much explanation. Marcos, who had always been a reserved and pragmatic man, knew his mother was hiding something. The frequent visits to the park, the distracted look during their conversations, all of it bothered him deeply. One night, unable to bear the curiosity any longer, Marcos decided to confront her. He waited until Martha returned home, and as soon as she walked through the door, he was waiting in the living room, arms crossed with a stern expression. "Where have you been?" he asked bluntly, his tone sharper than he intended. Martha stopped, surprised by her son's tone, but tried to remain calm. "I was at the park, Marcos. I didn't know I needed permission to go for a walk," she replied, trying to keep her tone light. But Marcos didn't back down. He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on her, and pressed on. "Mom, I've noticed you've been different. Always going out, always coming back with that distant look. Is this because of that man? The one you keep meeting at the park?" Martha was taken aback by the mention of Samuel. She tried to hide her reaction but couldn't. It was clear her son had noticed more than she realized. Taking a deep breath, she responded, "Yes, Marcos, I've been meeting with a man in the park. His name is Samuel, but he's just someone I share some stories with." "Someone you share stories with? Mom, do you think I'm blind? I know there's more to this story. You're hiding something from me," he insisted, his tone now loaded with resentment. Martha looked at him, searching for the right words, but everything felt out of place. She didn't know how to explain what she felt, the almost inexplicable need to be near Samuel, the silent hope that he might be someone she had spent so long searching for. "Marcos, it's not easy to explain. I have my reasons. There are doubts that have been with me for many years. Things I've never completely resolved." Martha hesitated, feeling the weight of her words. Marcos crossed his arms, his eyes narrowed with a mixture of frustration and pain. "Doubts? What kind of doubts, Mom?" he asked, trying to keep his composure. She looked down, knowing she couldn't tell him everything. At least not yet. "I need to figure this out on my own, Marcos. I don't want to involve you in something that might not even make sense. I just need a little more time." But to Marcos, that explanation sounded like an excuse. The unease inside him grew. His mother, the one person he had always trusted, was hiding something. And worse, her sudden obsession with Samuel seemed to cast doubt on all the love and dedication he had always believed existed between them. "So that's it? You're going to keep meeting with him without giving me any explanation?" Marcos questioned, his tone almost bitter. Martha tried to calm him down, but Marcos turned away before she could respond. With firm steps, he walked out, leaving her alone with a mind full of uncertainties and a heavy heart. His words echoed in her head. "You're going to keep meeting with him." She knew it wasn't fair to leave her son with so many doubts, but she was convinced she needed to discover the truth before revealing anything to him. As Marcos left, feelings of insecurity and betrayal accompanied him. He felt he had to find out for himself what was going on. If his mother wouldn't tell him the truth, he would find a way to get to it himself. This situation would gradually lead him to question everything he thought he knew about his own life. The days that followed his confrontation with his mother were difficult for Marcos. Frustration ate away at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental in his life was being kept from him. Determined to uncover the truth, Marcos decided to start an investigation on his own. If Martha wouldn't talk, he would find the answers another way. Marcos began revisiting old memories and sifting through family documents. It was during this search that something piqued his curiosity. Old hospital documents, papers worn with time but still legible. What caught his attention most was the lack of detailed information about his birth. This sparked a doubt he had tried to ignore but was becoming harder to dismiss. That same week he decided to hire a private investigator, determined to follow any lead that might shed light on the mystery. The first thing the investigator suggested was obtaining records from the hospital where Marcos was born. In a discreet meeting, the investigator shared some preliminary findings. Records of births on the same day and overlapping times between Marcos's birth and that of another baby, the child of a humble woman named Clara. This information left Marcos even more intrigued and led him to question his own past with an intensity he never imagined. Meanwhile, Martha continued meeting with Samuel, slowly building a relationship of trust. He was still guarded, but gradually allowed her to be part of his life, albeit cautiously. During one of their meetings, Samuel shared a childhood memory that deeply touched Martha. "One of the few memories I have is of a woman saying that someday someone would come looking for me, someone who was searching for me," he said, his eyes fixed on the ground. "I think I clung to that when I was little, but then, well, I learned not to have expectations." His words affected Martha profoundly. It was as if his words echoed the feeling she had always carried, that something had been taken from her and that she had spent her whole life searching for it without fully knowing what. Martha felt a surge of hope as Samuel shared that memory, and her determination to uncover the truth about him grew stronger each day. Meanwhile, the investigator Marcos hired brought him new information. He discovered that Clara, the woman mentioned in the records, was still alive and living in an impoverished community. Marcos hesitated upon hearing the news. He didn't know what he would find if he sought her out, but the doubt consuming him was stronger than his fear. By the end of that week, Marcos made the decision to find Clara. Without telling Martha, he set off to meet this woman who, according to the investigator, believed she had lost her son under mysterious circumstances. During the journey, Marcos felt his heart race, his palms sweat, and his mind filled with countless unanswered questions. When he arrived at the address, he found a modest home, almost hidden among other simple structures. He knocked on the door, and Clara greeted him with a cautious but kind look. He introduced himself vaguely, not revealing the true reason for his visit. She invited him in, and gradually they began to talk. Clara, unaware of who he truly was, naturally mentioned that she had lost a son at birth, a story of pain she seemed to have told many times. "I always believed he'd been taken by another family, a family with more resources," Clara said, her voice trembling but steady. Marcos felt a chill run down his spine. That information was enough to confirm that he needed to investigate even further. The impact of Clara's words was overwhelming, and he began to understand that perhaps his entire life had been built on a fragile foundation, full of secrets and uncertainties. His quest for the truth was becoming more intense, and he knew that from then on, nothing would ever be the same. The trip to Clara's house left Marcos in a state of confusion and uncertainty he had never experienced before. The words of that woman who spoke of her lost son with so much pain and hope echoed in his mind. At the same time, a silent anger began to rise within him, a feeling of betrayal he couldn't control. He wondered if everything he had lived through up to that point had been a lie. Back in his hometown, Marcos decided to confront Martha. He entered the house quietly and found his mother sitting in the living room, lost in thought. Martha looked worn down, her face showing the worry she had carried over the past few days. When she saw Marcos, her heart skipped a beat. There was something in his eyes that scared her, a coldness and distance she couldn't understand. "I need to talk to you, Mom," said Marcos, his voice firm, without any preamble. Martha recognized the seriousness in his tone and nodded, waiting for him to continue. But before she could respond, he got straight to the point. "I've been investigating some things about my birth. Things you never told me," he began, watching her every reaction. "I found a woman named Clara who believes she lost her son under strange circumstances. A woman who told me her child might have been taken by another family." The shock was evident on Martha's face. She tried to control her emotions, but her heart raced at the mention of Clara's name. The possibility that Marcos had discovered what she had feared for so long felt crushing. "Marcos, I can explain," Martha began, her voice faltering. But he interrupted her, his restrained anger spilling over. "Explain what, Mom? That I might not even be your son? That my whole life could have been built on a lie?" His voice was filled with hurt, and Martha realized that no matter how hard she tried, she might not be able to fix this. She took a deep breath and decided to share what was in her heart. She felt that if there was any chance of salvaging her relationship with her son, the truth would be the only way. "Marcos, I've always loved you as my son, but something inside me has always told me that something was wrong. When you were born, I had the feeling that something had happened, that maybe my baby had been switched. I tried to suppress that feeling, but I could never truly forget," Martha confessed, her eyes filling with tears. Marcos remained silent for a moment, absorbing her words. The pain in his chest grew, but he now saw that his mother too carried a heavy burden, a mystery she had never been able to resolve. "And that's why you're seeing that man, Samuel? Because you think he might be the son you lost?" he asked, his tone more controlled now, though still shaken. Martha nodded, looking down. The possibility that Samuel might be her son haunted her, and at the same time, the hope of finding an answer to so many years of uncertainty pushed her forward. "I'm not sure, Marcos. But yes, I think he might be. And I need to find out the truth, for him, for myself, and of course for you," Martha replied, struggling to hold back her tears. Marcos didn't know how to react. Part of him wanted to reject the possibility, to distance himself from the woman he had always called Mom, but another part knew that Martha was also a victim of something bigger than them. Finally, he sighed and looked her in the eyes, trying to find the strength to accept this revelation. "I'll give you the benefit of the doubt, Mom, but I need to know the truth about who I am, about who you are, and about this man, Samuel. If all this is real, then let's find out together," he said in a softer tone. Martha nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and deep fear. She knew the path to the truth would be difficult and painful, but with Marcos by her side, she had hope that somehow they could all find peace. With the decision to seek the truth, Martha and Marcos began facing the reality that both separated and united them at the same time. Martha with a heavy heart, knew her next step would be to confront Samuel more directly, without the hesitations she had carried from the start. She felt that he needed to understand why she was persistently present in his life. That afternoon, Martha found him sitting on the usual bench. He looked at her with an expression that mixed curiosity and resistance, as if he was already expecting a new approach. Martha took a deep breath and sat beside him, determined to speak. "Samuel, I think you deserve to know why I've been coming around," she began, looking directly into his eyes. He observed her in silence, but Martha saw something different in his gaze. It was as if, deep down, Samuel already suspected what she was about to say. "I lost a son many years ago, and ever since, I've always felt something was wrong. And when I saw the mark on your arm, Samuel, I think you might be my son." Samuel remained silent, and Martha felt the impact of her revelation ripple through the air like an electric current. He looked away, taking a deep breath, and for a moment he seemed on the verge of an outburst. "So that's it? You think I'm the son you lost?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief and even a hint of anger. "Don't come at me with this, Martha. My life has been one long string of abandonments and disappointments. Do you really think that after all this time, I'd just accept something like that?" "I understand it's hard, Samuel, but I believe there's something real connecting us. And I want to help. I want you to know you're not alone," Martha insisted, her voice wavering. He stood up, his face twisted in a mixture of pain and desperation. "Help? Help? Where were you when I really needed help? Where was this mother when I was cast aside, when I learned not to expect anything from anyone?" Samuel shouted, not caring who might hear them. Martha felt a wave of guilt and helplessness. She knew she couldn't change the past, but Samuel's pain was now so palpable that it seemed impossible to reach his heart. At that exact moment, Marcos appeared, drawn by the commotion. He observed the scene, bewildered, as Samuel continued hurling accusations at Martha, his words heavy with bitterness. When he noticed Marcos, Samuel let out a bitter laugh. "So you're the son who had everything, the son who got the love I never had?" Samuel asked, directing his words toward Marcos. "And now you think you can just fix it all?" Marcos, trying to stay calm, approached Samuel. "Samuel, I know all of this sounds crazy, but I'm also learning that my life isn't what I thought it was. I'm also trying to understand where I belong," Marcos said, his voice steady. Samuel shook his head in frustration and took a few steps back. "I spent my life building these walls so I wouldn't need anyone, and now you two show up, trying to convince me that this is all part of some bigger story, that suddenly I'm part of a family. I don't know if I can believe that." "Samuel, we're here because we want to understand together, and we need you for that," Martha said, holding back tears. Samuel sighed, looking at them both with an expression that wavered between anger and vulnerability. Without saying another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Martha and Marcos alone, with the weight of emotions echoing in the silence. Martha felt an empty ache growing, but Marcos placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. They both knew the road ahead was still long, but the search for the truth kept them steady, even if Samuel wasn't ready to accept them yet. The days following the confrontation were quiet and tense. Martha and Marcos felt the impact of Samuel's words, and he hadn't been seen since. Martha tried to hold on to hope, but the sadness and weight of decades of doubts left her exhausted. Meanwhile, Marcos supported her in any way he could, though he was also grappling with the revelation that he might never have been her real son. After much reflection, Martha decided to take a new step. She contacted Clara, the woman Marcos had discovered as his potential biological mother. Martha felt a mix of anxiety and empathy. She knew Clara also carried an old pain, and she hoped that together they might find some answers. The meeting took place in a small cafe on the city's outskirts. When they saw each other, Clara and Martha exchanged a deep look, almost as if each recognized the other's pain without needing words. They sat together, a silence between them heavy with mutual understanding. "I've imagined so many times what it would be like to see my son again," Clara began with a melancholy smile. "The thought that he was raised by someone else, by someone like you, Martha, gives me a bit of peace." Martha watched her, searching for the right words. She knew this woman, like herself, had lost something precious, and that both were united by a fate beyond their control. "I never really knew if something had happened at the hospital, but I always felt something was missing. And now, with Samuel and Marcos, I feel like what happened to us was a mistake that stole years from all of us," Martha replied, her voice trembling. Clara nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. She gently held Martha's hand, squeezing it softly. At that moment, they supported each other, two women marked by time and loss. They talked for hours, sharing memories and sorrows, exchanging words that brought them closer together. During the conversation, Martha realized Clara was a woman of great strength, someone who had fought alone but retained a kindness untouched by suffering. Listening to her stories, Martha felt that Clara's love for her lost son mirrored her own love for Samuel. It was as if she were finally seeing a reflection of herself, someone who understood the emptiness she carried. After that meeting, Clara asked to meet with Marcos. When he finally arrived, she looked at him with tear-filled eyes, trying to recognize the features she had always imagined for her son. Marcos, feeling equally emotional and confused, allowed himself to embrace her, though hesitantly. He felt a wave of affection and a new connection, something he had never experienced before. As Clara, Martha, and Marcos united around the wounds opened by the past, Samuel watched from afar, torn between the desire to be close and the resistance to getting involved. However, the bond beginning to form among them was chipping away at his emotional walls. He was starting to realize that, perhaps for the first time in his life, he had found something resembling a family. Even though uncertainties persisted, Martha knew that the first step toward healing had been taken, and now, with Clara by her side and Marcos working to reconcile with his identity, the future seemed less painful, as though the truth might finally bring some peace to them all. The weeks that followed were filled with discovery, acceptance, and deep reflection. Despite all his resistance, Samuel gradually allowed himself to be part of this new family. Between conversations with Martha and Marcos and his discreet meetings with Clara, he began to realize that their presence filled a void he'd never been able to name. The pain of the past still lingered, but something new was emerging, something he never imagined possible, a sense of belonging. Martha, Clara, Marcos, and Samuel decided that their experiences needed to become something meaningful. This story of loss, reunion, and renewed hope had to serve a greater purpose. One afternoon, as they discussed how to channel the pain they had lived through, the idea of creating an orphanage came up. Martha was the first to suggest it, her voice hesitant but determined. "We've spent so many years searching for a family and trying to understand what true love is. Maybe we can turn this into something that gives other children the chance we didn't all get." The proposal was met with enthusiasm. Samuel, who never imagined he'd be involved in something so selfless, was surprised by how much the idea resonated with him. Gradually, he allowed himself to dream of providing children with a home, a sense of security he himself never had. They began organizing the initial steps to establish the orphanage. Each contributed with their unique skills and experiences. Clara, with her knowledge and dedication to caring for children in her community; Martha, with her organizational abilities and the motherly love that overflowed in every gesture; Marcos, with his resources and connections, investing to bring visibility to the project. And Samuel, still shy but now fully committed, offered his help wherever needed, his presence becoming a steady rock for the group. Over time, the orphanage came to life, welcoming children who shared stories of abandonment but could now rely on a warm, loving home. The initiative captured the attention of the community and the media, which was moved by the story of a family that found redemption through love and care for the most vulnerable. Together, Martha, Clara, Samuel, and Marcos became a symbol of overcoming hardships, showing the world that it's possible to build a new reality despite loss and challenges. Each of them found something precious in the process. Martha discovered that her love knew no bounds. Clara reunited with the son she'd always believed was lost. Marcos redefined the meaning of his own life, and Samuel at last learned the value of having someone by his side. Their story spread, inspiring other families to overcome past pain and build a future grounded in empathy and unity. The orphanage became more than just an institution. It was a symbol of love and hope, a place where children found a new chance at life, and where a family, once torn apart by secrets, finally found the peace and fulfillment they had long sought. Thank you for following this heartwarming story of reunion, resilience, and transformation. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss new content. Now, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think Samuel made the right choice in allowing Martha and Marcos to get close to him, despite all the distrust and pain of his past? Or do you believe he should have gone on alone, the way he always knew? Leave your comment below. We'd love to know what you think about this journey of healing and hope. See you in the next video. Thank you for being part of this story.